So now we're ready for Chapter 7, Schindler's List. Oskar Schindler was a handsome German businessman who joined the Nazi Party in 1939. He was never particularly interested in politics. He liked expensive houses, fast cars, and opportunities to make money. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, he moved to Krakow, where the German authorities invited him to live in a big apartment previously owned by a Jewish family. Oskar Schindler knew Krakow well. Before the war, he had worked for his father, selling farm equipment, and business appointments frequently brought him to the city. Thanks to his contacts in business and government, Schindler received permission in 1940 to take over a factory located in a suburb of Krakow. He renamed his business the German Enamelware Factory, Amalia for short. Amalia was so close to the Krakow ghetto that Schindler made a deal with the German authorities to have Jews from the ghetto work for him. At first, his reason for wanting Jewish workers was simple. They were cheaper than non-Jewish workers, and Nazi policy declared that Jews were less than human, and the German government was happy to send him Jewish workers at a low price. Jewish workers also wanted longer and harder than non-Jewish workers, since workers meant they were useful and worth keeping alive. Excuse me. Since Schindler's factory was located near the Krakow ghetto, he had witnessed how badly the Nazis treated Jews. For him, Jewish workers were not just cheap labor, but also human beings, mothers, fathers, and children who were the innocent victims of Nazi cruelty. The closing of the Krakow ghetto was a problem for Oskar Schindler. He depended on having his workers close by, and now they would be 2 miles away in the Plaszow camp. He had a choice. He could move his factory closer to Plaszow, or he could keep his factory where it was and build a small camp, a sub-camp, where his workers could live. One day he approached Commandant Geth, had explained his idea for building a sub-camp close to the Amalia factory. It's a waste of time for prisoners to walk 2.5 miles from Plaszow, Schindler told Geth. It makes them tired and less productive. Let me build my own sub-camp where workers can live. They will get to the factory faster each morning. I have orders to fill for the government, and I need workers in the factory as many hours as possible each day. Besides, it will mean more money for me, and that will also be good for you. Then Schindler slid a bag of diamonds across the table to Geth. Geth put the bribe in his pocket and gave permission for Schindler to build his subcamp. Bribes were an important but costly part of Oskar Schindler's business dealings. He was obliged to pay bribes to get permits to build his factory, win contacts from the German government, and maintain good relationships with people on the black market who sold his pots and pans. The bribes included watches, cameras, saddles, boots, sports cars, diamonds, and lots of cash. Running a factory was costing him a fortune. This is important to know because eventually Schindler decided to spend any available money on bribes to help keep the Jewish workers alive. Sorry. That is what was earned, and he had such a cherished place both in history of the Holocaust and in the hearts of survivors. In December 1943, my mother learned that Oskar Schindler needed some prisoners to work in his factories. She sent me to speak with the person who wrote the list of Schindler Jews, meaning those prisoners assigned to work at the Amalia factory. And I begged him to put me and my mother on the list. This person once shared our apartment on Krakow Ghetto and may have felt an obligation toward us. He put our names on the list, and that's how my mother and I became Schindler's Jews. Soon after getting on the list, we moved into the Emilia camp. The entrance to Schindler's factory was a wide metal gate. Inside the gate were two buildings. In one building, workers manufactured metal pots and pans that were then dipped in enamel and dried. In the other building, workers made armaments for the German army, mostly shell casings polished by hand. Past these two buildings was the sub-camp with watchtowers for the German guards, a kitchen, washrooms, a food storage warehouse, offices, and barracks. The first time I saw Oskar Schindler, he was smoking a cigarette and wearing an expensive suit. There was a diamond swastika on his lapel. The swastika was the sign of Nazi Germany, so for Jews, it was the symbol of destruction and death. At the time, I didn't know much about him, just that he was a powerful person. But I learned that we had no need to be afraid of him. There aren't enough words to describe Oskar's kindness to his workers. To protect us, he made sure no Nazi guard ever entered the factory without his permission. He purchased food for us on the black market. This meant we ate better and stayed healthier than less fortunate Jews in the concentration camps who were given nothing but rotten soup. While millions of Jews were being murdered elsewhere, the Jews working for Oskar Schindler survived. We had medicine when we were sick, water and soap to stay clean, and decent food to eat. Each evening, Oskar announced that he needed some younger persons to clean his office. A group of us younger people would go to his office, lie down under the desks, and fall asleep. Oskar didn't really need help cleaning his office. It was a tactic, a way of providing for his younger workers with an excuse for refreshing themselves with a good night's sleep. I admired Oskar as he walked through his factory and stopped to talk with workers, calling them by name. He left half-smoked cigarettes at various stations, pretending he forgot them, when actually he was leaving them for men who had a smoking habit. I remember saying to myself, God has sent an angel to save us. We were still prisoners. We still worked long, hard days, and we were still hated by the Nazis. But for those of us lucky enough to work for Oskar, the Emilia factory was paradise. The factory operated round the clock, 24 hours a day. We worked in 12-hour shifts. Some of the adults carried and worked with heavy metal supplies and other industrial materials, which was too dangerous for a 13-year-old like me. Instead, I worked on a little machine that made small caliber bullet shells. The grown-ups worked on bigger machines that made bigger shells. Operating these bigger machines involved pushing a heavy lever up and down. Everyone had trouble with that lever, which was always breaking. One day, the factory foreman took me off my little machine and put me to work on one of the bigger machines, and right away it broke. The foreman came over and expressed anger over the breakdown. "You did this on purpose," he yelled. "I'm going to get a guard to shoot you." Although I know Oskar never allowed German guards to enter the factory unattended, let alone shoot anyone, I was terrified. One of the other workers ran to Oskar and told him what was going on, and he came down from his office to the factory floor. "What happened?" he asked. The foreman pointed at me and insisted I had broken the machine on purpose. Oskar looked at me and then at that big machine. "Don't ever put a little girl to work on such a big machine," he told the foreman. "Only men are allowed to work on that machine." I was crying from fear. Oskar patted me on the head and said, "Don't worry. Where were you working before?" I showed him the smaller machine. "That is where she should work," he instructed the foreman, "and that's where she should stay." After that, whenever Oskar toured the factory, he stopped by my spot and asked, "How are you doing, little one?" He was like a father watching over me and over all the people working for him. Then everything went terribly wrong. Chapter 8, 1944, Auschwitz. By summer of 1944, Nazi Germany was starting to lose the war. Thanks to constant attacks by American and British forces from the west and Soviet Russian forces from the east. The Germans knew that soon they would be held accountable for the torture and murders committed inside the camps. To hide their crimes, they began closing smaller camps, such as Plzew, and deporting prisoners to camps that were west inside Germany. Even though we worked for Oscar, we were still slaves of the Plzew administrators who put us to work helping close down the camp. Some of us were ordered to pack up stolen goods for shipment to Nazi headquarters in Berlin. These included gold watches, jewelry, silverware, paintings, and other possessions stolen from Jews. We placed these valuables in wooden crates, nailed the crates shut, and loaded them onto trains and trucks. We watched in terror as the Jews from Plzew were loaded onto trucks and trains and sent off to be killed. To give you an idea of how many were murdered, before the Germans closed the Plzew camp, there were about 18,000 women prisoners. After they closed the camp, fewer than 2,000 women prisoners remained, including me and my mother. Oscar worried that his factory would be closed and his Jewish workers deported along with the other prisoners to camps in Germany. Then he had an idea. It was risky, but he had always taken chances, and fortune often had been on his side. His idea was to dismantle the entire factory, equipment, machines, and supplies, load everything into boxcars, and relocate Amalia from Krakow, Poland, to Brunlitz, Czechoslovakia, which is now called Brunlik, I think, in the Czech Republic. There, near the town where he was born, he would reconstruct his factory and continue manufacturing ammunition. It took a lot of money to do this because he had to bribe dozens of officials with expensive gifts to get the permits needed for such a move, but he succeeded. Why did he go to so much trouble? One reason may have been selfish. He hoped that after the war he could rebuild his business in Czechoslovakia and continue making money. But another reason was unselfish. He knew the Nazis planned to murder as many Jews as possible before the Allies, meaning the American, British, and Russian armies, arrived. By relocating his factory, he hoped he could relocate his Jewish workers and save their lives. But even someone as influential as Oskar Schindler could not save us from all the horrors of the Holocaust, especially the terror known as Auschwitz. In October 1944, guards marched me, my mother, and the other Schindler women to a train station and shoved us into boxcars. Guards shut the big wooden doors and the train left the station. There was no water, food, bathroom, or windows, or even much oxygen. But we believed the train was taking us to Oscar's new factory in Czechoslovakia. So we were tolerating the overcrowding, hunger, and foul smells as best we could. After several hours, the train stopped. It was late at night. The doors opened and a blinding spotlight hit our eyes. When our sight adjusted, we saw barbed wire fences stretching in both directions. There was a terrible stench like rotting meat. German soldiers stood before us with rifles and dogs. I looked up and saw a sign that said, Auschwitz-Birkenau. We had heard rumors about this place. It was said to be a killing center where Jews were murdered in gas chambers and their bodies buried in crematoria ovens. There must be a mistake, we told ourselves. We worked for Oskar Schindler. Why were we in Auschwitz? Everyone off the train, guards yelled. Raus, quickly. The guards beat us with whips and made us jump onto the arrival platform. White flakes like snow were falling around us. We were thirsty after traveling so long without water and stuck our tongues out to catch the flakes, but they didn't taste like snow. We looked up, and we realized the flakes were falling from tall chimneys above the crematoria. White ashes, human ashes. My mother and I watched a German officer sort us into groups of those who were physically healthy and those who were not. He sent the strong women to the right and the weak or sickly women to the left. To make our shelves look healthier, we copied other women around us and pinched our cheeks until they were rosy. When our turn came, the guard looked at us and sent us to the right. We learned later that the weaker people in the left line went immediately to die in the gas chambers. Guards marched our group inside a barrack and told us to strip naked. We stood huddled together, shivering. What happened next was humiliating. Male prisoners wearing striped uniforms used rusty scissors and razor blades to shave off our hair. The equipment was old and dull and tugged painfully on our hair. Many of us began to cry. When I was little, I had beautiful, thick braids. In the Krakow ghetto, my mother had cut my hair short so it could be easier to keep clean. But a shaved head? That moment was the first time I felt as if I was losing my identity. I didn't feel like myself anymore. The women around me huddled together and shook like leaves from cold and fear. I thought, who can look like this and still survive? I stared up at the woman next to me and could hardly believe this bald person was my mother. Then guards pushed us into a dark room yelling, "Plaistow scum! We shouldn't be wasting our time with you." I looked up and noticed metal pipes with small holes crisscrossing the ceiling. We had no idea where we were or what this room was. We had heard rumors of people dying in gas chambers, but who could believe such a nightmare? We had no idea what would happen to us. All at once, something came out of the pipes and we held our breath. It was water. We weren't going to die that day. The cold shower ended, and women guards chased us out of the room with sticks. They pointed to piles of wooden shoes and ordered us to take one pair each, and then they pointed to a pile of clothes and yelled again to get quickly dressed. People grabbed whatever they could put their hands on. I saw a yellow dress with red flowers and tried to put it on, but it was huge, made for a heavy, tall woman, not a skinny 15-year-old. I tied the dress around my waist as best I could, and then they pushed us aside. This was late autumn, 1944. The weather was cold and it had been raining. Guards marched us down a muddy road and into a barrack where we collapsed on wooden bunks covered with a thin layer of smelly straw. There wasn't enough room for everyone, so some of the women lay down on the floor. The women in charge of our barracks were Hungarian. We didn't speak their language, and because we had no idea what they were saying, they would beat us for not obeying instructions. How did it feel to be yelled at in a foreign language, beaten with sticks, and not even know what we were supposed to do? How did it feel to be starving and not knowing if we were going to live one more day? How did it feel to be surrounded by prisoners who looked more dead than alive? It felt like the Nazis had taken my soul.